Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Last weekend, I had the great fortune to meet David Brown. He is descended from the US cavalryman pictured here, Samuel Truehart. He served in the 5th US Colored Cavalry, and I told his story in my 2012 book, African American Faces of the Civil War. I got to know David through emails, but it wasn't until last weekend that we met in person for the first time. Had a great conversation and just delighted to be able to talk to him in person about Samuel Truehart. So it seems like a good opportunity for me to tell you about Truehart's story. And to get there, we need to go to Kentucky in early 1865. So here we go. Imagine, if you will, jets of warm air streaming from the nostrils of 900 head of cattle. That streaming air is mixing with the frigid air and snowflakes on a blustery January morning. The hooves of the cattle are crunching against the frozen, snow covered pike en route from Camp Nelson to Louisville. From there, once those 900 head of cattle arrived, they would be sent south to feed Major General William T. Sherman's hungry army. There's about 80 horse soldiers driving that cattle. Half, about 40, were positioned in front of the herd, and the other half was behind. The troopers belonged to Samuel Truehart's Company E of the 5th. As the men and cattle moved outside the village of Simpsonville, the winter scene crumbled into chaos when a band of about 15 Confederate guerrillas, yelling like devils and shooting their pistols in the air, rode rapidly towards the panic stricken rear guard of the herd of cattle, recalled one eyewitness, who added, "They began shooting down the men without compunction." In fact, the guerrillas fired with deadly accuracy, leaving a trail of dying and desperately wounded troopers in their wake. The frosty, snow covered ground was stained with blood, and the dead bodies of the soldiers were stretched along the road. The sudden shock of the revolvers and the yelling Confederates spooked the cattle. The excited animals prevented the raiders from attacking the troopers and preventing more damage. The guerrillas couldn't get their way to the front, so they disappeared into the countryside. The advance guard, those men out in front, and alert villagers in Simpsonville heard the commotion, heard the firing, and they sped to the rear of the herd, the site of the massacre, and counted casualties. When they finished, they found about 22 of those 40 cavalrymen killed outright, and another 8 more desperately wounded. Truhart was one of those who survived. It's very well possible that he was in the front of the group, in the front of the herd. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Truhart and how he came to be part of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. Truhart, in fact, grew up in the same county, Shelby County, where the guerrilla attack occurred. He was one of a number of children born to a freeman, a barrel maker named Peter Truhart, and his wife. According to an oral history, his father, Peter, bought his mother out of slavery. Truhart remained in bondage. His master was Lewis Young, a farmer in his late 50s, who owned 4 slaves, including Samuel, at the start of the Civil War. Now, flash forward 3 years into the fall, until September of 1864, when Truhart joins the army at nearby Frankfort. The belief here is that he married a woman named Mary Elliott just prior to enlisting in the service. At that time, Mary was a slave reportedly born in Baltimore and had gone to become a cook at a boarding house in Frankfort where the two met. She ran away from her owner at the boarding house to marry Samuel. Now, Truhart became a private, as I mentioned earlier, in Company E of the 5th. That was at Camp Nelson, a bustling military base south of Frankfurt. The regiment was ordered into action before organizers actually completed the enrollment. The regiment joined a raid into southwestern Virginia. That was beginning on September 20th, only 8 days after Truhart mustered in. He had no training whatsoever, and all of a sudden, he's part of a cavalry regiment. The goal of this expedition into southwestern Virginia was a destruction of salt works near town, appropriately named Saltville, which held this vital mineral. It was a 3-week expedition, and it culminated in an assault on well-trenched Confederates who guarded the works. That assault on the Confederates failed. Now, the 5th fought dismounted, suffered heavy casualties, and received praise for its performance. The regiment's commander, Colonel James Brisbane, who was a peacetime anti-slavery orator, declared, "I can only say that the men could not have behaved more bravely. I've seen white troops fight in 27 battles and never saw any fight better." However, there were black men, those Confederate, that captured some of those black men in the 5th and murdered them. The murders of black prisoners by the Confederates overshadowed the outcome of the battle and became big news. Truhart was not among them. He made it back safely. He survived and went back to Camp Nelson, where he was admitted to the hospital with an undisclosed ailment. That was at the very end, after the expedition. It is possible that he returned to duty in time to participate in a second effort to destroy the salt works. That was in December, just a couple months after that first expedition. The second expedition succeeded in destroying the salt works. A month after that second successful expedition, January of 1865, is when Truhart and his company were escorting those cattle on the way to Camp Nelson. And that was that January 25th, 1865 day when the guerrillas attacked and caused the deaths of 22 men and 8 others wounded. The deaths of those men and the attack by the guerrillas was widely reported, and it was described as the Simpsonville slaughter. The Louisville Journal, in fact, said it was a horrible butchery. The 5th spent the remainder of its enlistment on garrison duty in Kentucky and Arkansas. Truhart mustered out with his comrades at Helena in March of 1866. Truhart, the war over for him, returned to Kentucky, reunited with Mary, and started a family that grew to include 5 children, one of whom tragically died in infancy. By the late 1870s, as post-Reconstruction policies and paramilitary groups threatened and oppressed freedmen, the Truharts joined a mass exodus from the South to Kansas. These men, women, and children became known as exodusters. The Truharts migrated to the western part of the state, took possession of a 40-acre plot of land near Nicodemus, an all-black town founded in 1877. Truhart added to his holdings by adding another 120 acres. However, it was not destined to be their home. Mary, his wife, refused to live on this remote farm, and the family moved about 275 miles east to Atchison. Truhart found employment working as a teamster and earned a reputation as an industrious man. He lived until 1897 and was remembered as a pioneer settler. So thanks for listening to the story of Samuel Truehart and his service in the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. And again, a special thanks to David Brown for sharing this wonderful and unique image of his ancestor and providing so much information that enabled me to share the story with you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.